We begin this hour with Donald Trump's revenge tour suffering a major defeat. A federal judge blocked a pair of subpoenas that the Justice Department had issued to Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, seeking records on a big renovation to the central bank. In a blistering ruling, Judge James Boasberg wrote, quote, "There is abundant evidence that the subpoena's dominant, if not sole purpose, is to harass and pressure Powell, either to yield to the president or to resign, and make way for a Fed chair who will." But it's not just a loss for Trump. It's arguably an even bigger loss for Trump's D.C. U.S. Attorney, Jeanine Pirro. Since her appointment, the former Fox host failed to get a D.C. jury to convict the so-called sandwich guy who threw a sandwich at federal agents. Her office also recently closed cases into 6 Democratic lawmakers who urged members of the military to not comply with unlawful orders. Pirro's investigation into a criminal probe on whether former President Joe Biden and his aides unlawfully used an auto pen to issue pardons has also been reportedly dropped. And to say Pirro didn't react well to this most recent judicial ruling is maybe putting it mildly.
He has neutered the grand jury's ability to investigate crime. As a result, Jerome Powell today is now bathed in immunity, preventing my office from investigating the Federal Reserve. This outrageous decision will be appealed by the United States Department of Justice.
Wow.
Joining us now to discuss is Natasha Surin, professor at Yale Law School and president of the Budget Lab at Yale. So, Natasha, bathed in immunity. It almost sounds like a spa service.
That was not the most unhinged part of that.
I mean, talk about dramatics. Jeez.
But I did want to ask you about what you think the consequences might be for the Federal Reserve and really for the country writ large, because Jeanine Pirro has said she will, in fact, appeal this decision.
She has said that. I will say this is a really sort of important moment for the rule of law, for institutions in this country, and for central bank independence. Because what you heard from Judge Boasberg today is kind of reinforcing what Chair Powell has previously said. There is no reason why this criminal investigation should exist into the chair's activities. This is all a pretext for the fact that the president would like to see lower interest rates and would like to see a different Fed chair. And frankly, none of it has really made that much sense to me over the course of the last many months, because, of course, he has the opportunity to appoint a new chair come May. And if anything, all of these antics are just making it more difficult for that chair to ultimately be confirmed because of real concerns that this administration does not respect the independence of the central bank. And so I hope that this is a moment where we're going to see some removal from these sorts of activities and accusations.
Not from the Republican Party.
But you're not seeing it yet, and you've heard them say that they're going to appeal the decision. So we kind of are where we are.
The name up for May is Kevin Warsh. Do you think he's been set up for failure here by the president? I mean, is this a job anyone should want at this point?
You know, it's a complicated thing. The chair of the Federal Reserve is arguably the second most important person in the country after the president.
I would say in the world, maybe.
The world. And frankly, they have a really, really difficult challenge at any moment, because they're trying to navigate not just the sort of monetary policy, what should the interest rate be in this country, how do we think about inflation and employment, but they're also trying to think through, how do we think about bank supervision? How do we think about the safety and soundness of our financial system? And so that role is supremely, supremely important. And the reason, kind of the special sauce part of it, at least, of what makes the American economy great, is that that role is one that is insulated from politics. In moments in this country when you haven't seen that insulation, like when President Nixon put a lot of pressure on his Fed chair, Arthur Burns, that was a recipe for inflation and disaster. And in some sense, Kevin Warsh must be worrying that he is actually being held to that type of potential future, and worried about the risks that not just to the Federal Reserve, but also to himself in that potential role.
Natasha, the lawyer in me wants to go back to Judge Boasberg's decision, because this is not this administration's first run-in with this judge in particular.
Boasberg, yeah.
They've been tussling with this judge repeatedly. In this ruling, I noted that he says, quote, "A mountain of evidence suggests that the dominant purpose is to harass Powell, to pressure him. to lower rates. You just talked about the importance of an independent central bank. What does that say to you when you hear that from Judge Boasberg in this decision?
You know, I will say this, and also the tariff decision from the Supreme Court recently. In some sense, I'm sad for the country that we're at the moment where we are having to have these gigantic economic questions, which really are, frankly, settled by the nature of our institutions. The Federal Reserve is independent. The power to tax lies with Congress. And yet you're seeing an administration that via executive action is trying to kind of take those sorts of powers away from those types of institutions in this country. My hope is that what these decisions tell you, what Judge Boasberg's words today, what the Supreme Court overruling the administration on tariffs tell you, is that the rule of law still reigns supreme in this country. And as a law professor, there frankly isn't anything much more optimistic that I could say than that. I think it's a great fact that we're starting to see real pushback to these administrations' very clearly unlawful actions.
I want to ask you, if I can, about the war and how that's impacting this broader debate that we're having about inflation right now, because the timing also overlaps when Kevin Warsh is supposed to be confirmed. I believe Goldman Sachs initially thought that there was going to be a rate cut in June, but now it looks like it's going to be in September.
Totally.
June is when he's expected to have his first Fed chair meeting. So just give me a sense of like how the war looms large over what is happening at the Fed and how it complicates things for incoming chair Kevin Warsh.
You know, there's some great irony here, right? Because the president has said so explicitly, so much so that that's what this whole argument with Chair Powell is about, that he thinks interest rates should be lower and he would like Americans, frankly, to have lower rates on their mortgages and on their car loans. By initiating this war in Iran that is driving up energy prices and driving up inflation through actions like the tariffs, he is making all of that harder. Before the war, the market was expecting to see 2 rate cuts this year and expecting to see them as early as this summer. Now the expectation is 1 rate cut and pushing that out further into the fall. And so all that is to say, like, in some sense, and we said this at the beginning of this administration, the president inherited a pretty strong economy. He inherited an economy that was recovering from COVID with inflation still too high, but inflation on the way down. And what he's done to that economy, a pretty strong labor market, is he's instituted tariff at levels that we haven't seen in a century and taken actions like the war in Iran, which have a lot of reasons why they're problematic. But one of them is certainly this impact that it's having on energy prices in this country. And that's something that Americans are feeling quite tangibly immediately.
And it's not just energy prices, right? It's fertilizer prices are going up, which means food prices. Yeah. So when Antonia asked about, is this a job anyone wants, I think part of the reason why, if I were Kevin Warsh, maybe I would be a little bit skittish about taking this job, is that it's not just that you'll have the president leaning on you and leaning on the Fed and trying to politicize the Fed that has had this hard-won political independence. It's that you have basically gotten the job because you've made a promise to cut rates, and the president is creating all of these conditions that make it much harder to cut rates. Like, I mean, mortgage rates are already going up as a result of all of this, as you point out, and you mentioned Goldman Sachs said the expectations for rate cuts have been pushed further away. So I just wonder, like, how does the Fed, how would a potential new Fed chair digest this information and still appease the president?
You remember that the Fed chair is 1 vote on a 12-person committee that sets interest rates. And so, frankly, if the Fed chair was to walk into the next meeting and say, you know what, the president wants to see interest rates at 1%, so that's what they're going to be, there would be 11 dissents from that Fed chair. And so, in some sense, what I'm a little bit more optimistic about the nature of the central bank's capacity to navigate through this tumultuous moment, in part because I'm also watching the legal system and the judiciary do its job with respect to protecting that independence and making it very clear that it will continue to do so against any adverse threats from this administration or anyone else.
America's future is in the hands of the judiciary. I have been saying that and will continue to do so.
I think it's in the hands of the voters.
They got to be able to vote.
Yeah, they got to be able to vote.
Well
said.
Natasha Saren, thank you so much. Great to see you as always.